The crystal goblets sparkled in the glow of candlelight, wine swirling deep red as 12 members of the Whitmore family lifted their glasses for grace. Within moments, their lives would be slipping away. This is the story of how one enslaved woman brought down an entire Mississippi plantation with nothing more than patience, arsenic, and a simple ladle. Clara stood quietly in the doorway that connected the kitchen to the dining room. Her hands were folded neatly over her apron as she watched the Whitmore family settle into their evening meal on a heavy August night in 1847. From the parlor, the grandfather clock rang 7 times, each strike hanging in the thick Mississippi air like a warning bell. The smell of roasted duck filled the room, mixing with the sweetness of magnolia drifting through the open windows. But beneath it all was something more sinister, the faint metallic scent of arsenic that no one at the table could yet notice. Before diving further into this chilling part of history, tell me, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are right now? Share in the comments below. And if stories like this grab your attention, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear was hidden away in courthouse records for over 100 years. The Whitmore plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of cotton fields just outside Natchez, where the Mississippi River curved like a giant spine. Judge Cornelius Whitmore ran the estate with the same iron hand he used in his courtroom. His wife, Margaret, managed the house, and 47 enslaved people with what she liked to call Christian firmness. Their 4 grown children had returned home to celebrate the judge's 62nd birthday, bringing along spouses and grandchildren. The great house rang with laughter that would soon turn to screams. Clara had been brought to the Whitmore household 11 years earlier, purchased at auction in New Orleans. She had been torn from her 2 young daughters, sold away to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, never to see them again. In the Whitmore kitchen, she became nearly invisible, just a pair of hands stirring pots, kneading bread and seasoning meals with a skill that made the judge boast that his table was the finest in Adams County. "Pass the duck, would you?" Margaret Whitmore asked her eldest son, never noticing how Clara's sharp eyes followed every movement from her place by the door. The poison had been surprisingly easy to get. Arsenic was sold as rat poison at the local general store. A black woman buying it raised no questions. The big house always had rats. Clara had been collecting it for 3 months, hiding small portions inside a hollow gourd tucked behind flour sacks. She knew exactly how much was needed. Enough to kill, but not enough to alert anyone with a bitter taste in the first bite. At the table, 6-year-old Emma, the youngest grandchild, pushed her vegetables around her plate. "These taste funny, grandmother," she whispered. "Nonsense," Margaret replied firmly. "Clean your plate. Clara's cooking is above reproach." But this time, Clara's seasoning was more than just skill. She had mixed poison into the wine reduction that coated the duck, stirred it into the creamy vegetable sauce, and even sprinkled it like sugar over the birthday cake waiting in the kitchen. Every dish on that table carried death. The family chatted on, discussing cotton prices, marriages, and upcoming social events, completely unaware that poison was already spreading through their blood. Judge Whitmore raised his glass for another toast, his third of the evening. "To family," he declared, his voice already beginning to slur, though he blamed the wine. "To prosperity, to the natural order of things." Clara's hands gripped the doorway. By 7:45, young Emma vomited across the white tablecloth. Her mother rushed to help, only to collapse herself, her legs giving way. The judge tried to stand, his face turning a dark shade of purple as his hands clawed at his throat. One by one, like dominoes, the Whitmore family members began to convulse. "The food," someone gasped. "We've been poisoned." Every eye turned toward the kitchen doorway, but Clara was already gone. The dining room erupted into chaos, chairs overturning, bodies falling to the floor. The youngest Whitmore son crawled toward the exit but collapsed just inches away. Margaret, even as foam gathered at the corners of her mouth, found just enough strength to scream one word that echoed across the plantation. "Clara." But here, what history books don't record, the others in the house that night. The enslaved footmen who could have run for a doctor but moved slowly instead. The housemaids who heard the screams but calmly finished folding laundry before stepping into the hall. The stable boy who saw Clara heading toward the river with a bundle but stayed silent until the next morning. What would you have done, standing in that doorway watching your oppressors suffer? Would you have helped them? Or would you have walked into the night like Clara, leaving only silence behind? On August 18, 1847, 12 people sat down to dinner at the Whitmore plantation. By morning, the great house was as quiet as a tomb. Clara was already 20 miles downriver, following the invisible path of the Underground Railroad, her freedom bought with nothing but arsenic and rage. But the nightmare inside the dining room didn't end with overturned chairs and untouched cake. By 8:15, the scene looked like a battlefield where the enemy could not be seen. Judge Whitmore collapsed face first into his own birthday cake. The true terror of arsenic poisoning isn't just death, it's the waiting. Inside that grand house, the Whitmore family twisted in agony, each symptom unfolding like a grim performance. The grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, each sound marking their descent into darkness. The sweet smell of magnolia was long gone, replaced by the stench of vomit, sweat, and fear, while the polished oak floors grew slick with what their bodies could no longer hold. Through the tall windows, the slave quarters glowed with lamplight, but no one came running. Dr. Edmund Hayes lived just 3 miles away, serving plantation families across Adams County with a mix of modern medicine and old Mississippi methods. But that night, his horse stayed unsaddled, and his medical bag stayed closed. The young man who should have gone to fetch him, a 17-year-old enslaved worker named Thomas, stood frozen in the main hallway. He watched as Judge Whitmore clawed across the Persian rugs that had cost more than Thomas could ever earn in 10 lifetimes. Decades later, Thomas recorded his memories in his diary. August 18, 1847, I could have run for the doctor. God knows I could have. But I thought of my sister sold away when the judge needed quick money. And so I stood there. I watched. In the dining room, Margaret Whitmore, her body already burning from the inside out, managed to drag herself toward the silver bell used to summon servants. She rang it again and again, the sharp notes cutting through the air like desperate screams. In the kitchen, 6 enslaved workers heard it perfectly. They looked at each other, no words, just glances that carried meaning, and then turned back to their dishes, continuing to scrub as if nothing had happened. The youngest grandchild, 6-year-old Emma, was the first to die. Her tiny body simply couldn't fight the poison. Her mother, Rachel Whitmore, clutched her daughter's lifeless body, crying with a grief that went beyond her own agony. "Why?" she screamed, to heaven, to the servants, to anyone who might listen. But innocence, Clara knew, had never protected enslaved children from being beaten, sold, or worked to death. James Whitmore, the judge's son and a lawyer from Jackson, had inherited not only his father's sharp jawline but also his cruelty. Even as his body betrayed him, he tried to give orders. "Block the roads," he gasped. "Find that woman. There will be hell to pay." From the quarters, field hands heard the commotion, retching, screaming, furniture crashing. Some pulled their thin doors shut, clutching their children tight. Others sat quietly on porches, listening, silent witnesses to a justice they had never dared imagine. Old Moses, who had once lost 3 fingers to the judge's temper, even allowed himself a small smile. Meanwhile, Clara moved quickly along the swamp paths she had memorized during 11 years of bondage. For years, she had studied these routes under every full moon while gathering herbs for the kitchen, preparing for a night like this. In her bundle, she carried a change of clothes, $37 stolen gradually from Margaret's drawer, and forged papers nomming her as a free woman, Sarah Coleman. Back inside the dining room, Judge Whitmore had a sudden, terrifying moment of clarity. His bloodshot eyes locked on the portrait of his father above the mantel, a man who had also died suddenly at dinner 20 years earlier. Was that murder, too? How many meals in their family had been seasoned with revenge? "The children," Margaret wheezed, reaching for her sons even as her vision blurred. "Save the children." But there would be no saving, no last-minute remedies, no desperate rides for help. The arsenic was doing its work, shutting down organs step by step. Clara had studied it carefully, listening in silence during Dr. Hayes's visits, pretending to dust while memorizing his words about dosages and symptoms. She had even tested small amounts on plantation dogs to perfect her timing. This wasn't impulse. It was calculation. By 9:00, half the family was already unconscious. The others, still awake, could only watch their loved ones fade, knowing their turn was near. James Whitmore used his final strength to scrawl a shaky note on a napkin. Clara did this, as if anyone would have needed proof. But here's the detail history doesn't often tell. In the quarters, Clara's closest friend, Ruth, whispered that Clara had never planned to poison the entire family. Her original plan was to kill only the judge. Something had changed that very morning, something that convinced Clara that one death wasn't enough. As the night dragged on, the house grew quieter. Voices fell silent, replaced by ragged breathing and low groans. The candles burned lower, their shadows flickering against the walls, making the dying appear to move even when they were still. Outside, a mockingbird sang its nighttime chorus of stolen songs. Inside, another kind of theft was taking place. Lives for lives, a family for a family. By 10:00, only Margaret still clung to consciousness. Her fingers held tightly to her husband's cold hand. In her delirium, she whispered apologies, not to God, but to someone named Bessie. The housemaid listening in the hallway knew the name well. Bessie had died in childbirth after the judge refused to fetch a doctor, saying she wasn't worth the expense. The last sound Margaret heard before darkness took her was not prayer, not comfort, but the creak of footsteps. The household staff finally entered the dining room. They did not rush to help. They stood in a semicircle, quiet as shadows, watching their owners take their final breaths. Their faces showed no joy and no pity, only a memory they would carry forever. At 11:47 p.m., 12 members of the Whitmore family lay dead in their finest clothes, the birthday cake still decorated with candles that had never been lit. The great house fell into a silence so deep you could hear the Spanish moss brushing softly against the windows. Somewhere in the darkness, between Mississippi and freedom, Clara stopped by a creek to wash the flour from under her fingernails, the last trace of her years in the kitchen. The water carried it away, erasing her old life as she moved toward her new one. But for the enslaved people left behind, the night was far from over. They would face questions, investigations and dangers that would ripple through Adams County like waves from a stone dropped into still water. At dawn, the Whitmore plantation looked frozen in time. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, falling across 12 corpses seated around a dining table, a macabre still life of death. Birthday candles had melted into waxy puddles, never lit. What happens when every white member of a plantation dies in one night? At 5:30 a.m., the roosters crowed as usual, indifferent to the carnage inside the big house. The morning air carried the sweetness of honeysuckle mixed with the stench of death. Dew clung to spiderwebs strung across the porch railings, like nature's own crime scene tape. In the quarters, 47 enslaved people faced an impossible choice: report what had happened and risk brutal interrogations, or take this rare moment to claim freedom. Ruth, Clara's closest friend and the Whitmores' head housemaid for 15 years, was the first to act. Trusted with keys to nearly every room except the judge's study, she now entered that forbidden space for the first time. Her hands shook as she rifled through papers, land deeds, contracts, bills of sale. She found her own name, listed like livestock with a price tag, $800. "Burn it all," whispered Samuel the blacksmith. "Say bandits came in the night." But old Moses, leaning on his cane with his three-fingered hand, shook his head. "You think they'll believe bandits poisoned a family at dinner? They'll hang every one of us before asking questions." The debate carried on in hushed voices while upstairs, flies had already begun to gather. By 7:00 a.m., they had agreed on a story. A field hand named Jupiter was sent to the neighboring Turner plantation with news. The Whitmores had all taken sick during dinner and died, despite the servants' best efforts to save them. No mention of Clara. As far as anyone knew, she had been sold to a plantation in Georgia 2 weeks earlier. From the Adams County Courthouse records, dated August 19, 1847. Witness statements claimed the cook, Clara, had been transferred to the Belmont estate on August 5. Bill of sale produced by surviving household staff. Investigation ongoing. That bill of sale was Ruth's masterpiece. She had forged it that very morning, using ink mixed with coffee grounds and smoke to make it look aged. She had practiced the signature 100 times until it was perfect. Clara had secretly taught her to read and write by candlelight, risking lashes for every stolen lesson. Now that knowledge was saving them all. When Sheriff William Donovan arrived at 9:43 a.m. with the county coroner, he found a scene carefully arranged. Some servants cried loudly over the bodies, while others scrubbed at stains that could never be washed away. Ruth met him at the door, her eyes red from rubbing them with onion juice. "It happened so fast, Sheriff," she sobbed. "One moment they were celebrating, the next." She gestured helplessly toward the dining room. Dr. Marcus Webb, the coroner, was a meticulous man who had trained in Philadelphia before returning south. He examined the bodies with clinical precision: cherry-red skin, contracted pupils, foam dried at the corners of mouths. His assessment: arsenic poisoning without question. And by the amounts he calculated, whoever did it had access to pounds of the substance. "Who prepared the meal?" Sheriff Donovan asked, though he already suspected the answer. "We all did," Ruth replied smoothly, a half-truth wrapped in loyalty. "Clara made the sauces before she left, but I finished the cooking. Samuel carved the duck. Letty prepared the vegetables. If the food was tainted, every one of us touched it." It was a brilliant answer. Spread the blame so thin it became untouchable. The sheriff searched the kitchen, finding it spotless. The enslaved staff had spent the night scrubbing away every trace of preparation. The pantry showed only ordinary ingredients. Even the rat poison behind the flour sacks was accounted for, exactly the amount listed on the purchase slip from 6 months earlier. But Dr. Webb noticed something everyone else missed. On the kitchen floor lay a single magnolia petal, carried in on someone's shoe. Magnolia trees didn't grow near the kitchen, only down by the river path. "Search the grounds," Sheriff Donovan ordered. "Every cabin, every outbuilding." The search turned up nothing unusual. Thin mattresses stuffed with corn husks, mended clothes, a few hidden coins. But what they didn't find, that was what mattered most. No letters, no books, not a single trace remained of the secret school Clara had run for 3 years. She had been teaching others to read in secret, using Bible verses as practice. By 3:00 a.m., every scrap of those lessons had been burned, the ashes scattered quietly across the vegetable garden. By midday, whispers of what happened spread across all of Adams County. White families bolted their doors, staring at their servants with new suspicion. Some went so far as to dismiss their cooks, choosing empty stomachs over imagined danger. At the Turner Plantation, fear turned into routine. Every enslaved worker was forced to taste each dish before the family would dare eat, turning mealtimes into tests for poison. Meanwhile, Clara was miles away, riding in a lumber wagon driven by Josiah, a free black man tied to the Underground Railroad, a hidden network that worked like quiet prayers across the Deep South. She had reached the Louisiana border, her forged documents passing quick inspection. The wagon itself had hidden compartments carrying 3 more escapees, but Clara sat in the open, presenting herself as Sarah Coleman, a seamstress on her way to visit relatives in Baton Rouge. Back at the Whitmore plantation, things grew tense. A judge from Jackson arrived to oversee the complicated legal mess. With no surviving white heirs and the family wiped out, ownership of the property, and the 47 enslaved people hung in uncertainty. They lived in a terrifying limbo, still considered property but belonging to no one for the moment. Sheriff Donovan intensified his questioning. Each worker was called in separately as he searched for cracks in their story. But they stayed firm to the version Ruth had carefully created. Clara had been sold. The family had eaten normally. The illness had struck suddenly. When Donovan pressed for details about Clara's life in Georgia, Ruth calmly produced letters she had forged weeks earlier in preparation for this exact moment. "She writes that the Belmont family treats her kindly," Ruth murmured, keeping her eyes low. "She misses her friends here but accepts God's will." God's will wrapped in arsenic. That afternoon, Dr. Webb completed autopsies on every body. His conclusion was undeniable: massive arsenic poisoning, deliberate and planned, not an accident. But with Clara supposedly gone to Georgia and no one willing to betray the truth, the case stalled. As evening fell and the Whitmore family's bodies were prepared for burial, the enslaved people gathered quietly in their quarters. They prayed together, but their eyes told a deeper story. They had survived the first round of questioning. Now came the greater challenge: keeping the same story straight under growing pressure, under bribes and threats, under the promise of reward for betraying Clara. Old Moses raised his 3-fingered hand toward heaven. "Lord, we pray for the souls of the dead," he said. "May they find in death the peace they denied others in life." "Amen," the voices answered, their sound carrying across the cotton fields. Tomorrow they would return to work, the plantation still moving by habit while lawyers decided who owned them now. But survival depended on getting through the next test, because Sheriff Donovan had just learned something devastating. A telegram from Georgia confirmed it. There had never been a Belmont plantation. Clara had not been sold there. The story was a lie. Donovan stormed into the Whitmore kitchen, his boots striking the wooden floor like a judge's gavel. He slammed the telegram onto the table. "There is no Belmont plantation. There never has been," he said coldly. "You've all been lying to me." The morning sun slanted through the windows, casting shadows like prison bars across the 6 enslaved workers lined up before him. Their carefully woven story was unraveling. Ruth's face remained calm, though her heart pounded in her chest. Years of survival had taught her to reflect back only what the white men wanted to see. But the paper in Donovan's hand might as well have been a noose. Behind her, Samuel's breath came heavy. Letty trembled. Fear hung thick in the air, as heavy as Mississippi's summer heat. Donovan lowered his voice, which made his words cut deeper than a shout. "Now," he said, almost whispering, "let's talk about what really happened to Clara." 20 miles away, Clara, living as Sarah Coleman, sat quietly in the colored section of a steamboat moving up the Mississippi River. The ticket collector barely glanced at her papers, distracted by a white woman complaining about her cabin. Clara kept her head low, her fingers clutched around a rosary she had never used before, playing the part of a religious freedwoman on her way to Memphis for church work. From the New Orleans Daily Picayune, August 21, 1847. 12 dead in Adams County. Entire plantation family poisoned. Negro cook suspected. $100 reward for information leading to capture. Back in the Whitmore kitchen, Ruth made her move. "Clara has been different since her daughters were sold," she admitted, her voice breaking as real tears filled her eyes. She remembered those children, remembered Clara's grief. She said she had a cousin in Georgia who could get her work. "We helped her leave because we feared what she might do." Donovan pressed, 2 weeks ago, just like you said." "Yes," Ruth nodded. The sheriff scanned each face, hunting for cracks. But these were people who had lived their entire lives hiding their thoughts, swallowing their words, and learning how to survive by becoming invisible. They gave Donovan nothing. Meanwhile, the legal vultures descended on the Whitmore estate. Relatives who had barely spoken to the family suddenly appeared from 3 different states, each claiming rights to the property. Lawyers rolled in with their carriages, coldly calculating the worth of land, cotton, and even human lives with equal detachment. The 47 enslaved people were inspected like furniture, their future hanging in legal limbo. That afternoon, Donovan issued an order unlike anything Adams County had seen before, a full-scale manhunt. Riders were sent to every major road, river crossing, and railway station within 100 miles. Notices went up in every town square from Natchez to New Orleans describing Clara, Negro woman, about 30 years old, 54, tall, small scar on left hand from a kitchen burn. But Clara had prepared for this. Before leaving, she had lightened her skin slightly with lye, styled her hair in a new way, and padded her clothing to make herself look heavier. The scar on her hand was hidden under gloves stolen from Margaret Whitmore's dresser, fine kid leather gloves that marked her as a lady of means, not a runaway cook. The search took on new urgency when investigators uncovered something in Clara's abandoned cabin, a small journal written in a rough code. Dr. Webb worked tirelessly to decipher it, and when the meaning finally came clear, he was shaken. The book contained recipes, but not for food. Each page held instructions for poisons, dosage calculations, and most chilling of all, a list of names with dates beside them. My God, Webb muttered. The Whitmores had not been her first. 3 other plantation families appeared on those pages, all prominent, all dead under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. The Hendersons in 1843, patriarch died suddenly of stomach illness. The Beauregards in 1845, 2 sons dead from poisoned whiskey. The Lancasters in 1846, the matriarch and her daughter lost to what had been called summer fever. Clara had lived and worked at each estate, moving on only after tragedy struck. Now the pattern was clear. She had built trust, waited for the right moment, and then killed with precision before being sold to her next household. The Whitmores, it seemed, had been her masterpiece, her final act before vanishing. Bodies were exhumed. Tests confirmed arsenic in each case. The discovery sent shockwaves through Mississippi society. Fear spread like wildfire. How many other cooks were quietly planning revenge? How many loyal servants were simply biding their time? Paranoia gripped the plantations. Kitchens were locked each night. Food tasters became the norm. Some families dismissed their entire staffs, cooking for themselves rather than risk a poisoned plate. On the river, Clara listened as white passengers gossiped about the murders with horrified fascination. A woman in silk swore she could never again trust her cook of 20 years. A merchant declared that all household slaves should be chained at night. A preacher insisted the killings proved the African race was incapable of Christian mercy. Clara sat quietly, her fingers brushing the vial of poison still hidden in her bodice, a final dose she carried for herself. If capture came, she would rather die free than return to bondage. By the 4th day, the manhunt had stretched into neighboring states. The reward climbed to $2,000. Professional slave catchers joined the search, men skilled enough to track runaways across rivers and stone. They brought hounds trained on clothes from Clara's cabin, but Ruth had cleverly rubbed those garments with pepper and turpentine, confusing the dog's senses. Still, the real strength of Clara's escape wasn't in tricks but in the network. The Underground Railroad had been preparing for her journey for months. At every stop, she was handed off to strangers who asked no questions. A minister in Baton Rouge, a shopkeeper in Memphis, a farmer near Nashville, all risked their lives for a woman they had never met, united only by the belief that freedom was worth any cost. One of the closest calls came at the Tennessee border. A slave catcher named Briggs tracked her trail to a safe house, arriving just hours after she had gone. The house was empty except for Aunt Cora, a 73-year-old free black woman. "You're lying," Briggs snapped. "You're hiding someone." Cora gave him a tired smile. "Sir, I'm 73 years old. What use would I have for fugitives? I can barely care for my own bones." He left empty-handed, never noticing the fresh wagon tracks headed north, or the way Cora's hands trembled once the door shut. Back at the Whitmore plantation, pressure mounted. Estate lawyers had brought in a new overseer, a harsh man named Patterson. He believed in crushing spirits to force the truth. He started with the children, asking them who Clara had spoken to, where she might have gone. But the children had been well trained. "We don't know," they said. "We never saw." Clara, they insisted, kept to herself, mourning her daughters. Then one boy, no older than 8, looked Patterson directly in the eye. "She told me once," he said carefully, "that poison was sweeter than sugar if you served it right." Every adult in the room froze, holding their breath. But Patterson only laughed. "Children and their wild stories," he said, dismissing it. The boy had delivered exactly what Ruth had taught him. just strange enough to sound like childish nonsense, but not enough to betray the truth. 3 states away, Clara finally reached an Ohio station where she could breathe without fear. The safe house was run by Quakers who asked her for nothing more than her given name. Not Clara, not Sarah, but the name she had been born with before slavery had stripped it away, Adonai. In her mother's Yoruba tongue, it meant beloved. That night in the safety of a quiet room, she whispered it softly into the darkness, Adonai. For the first time in 30 years, she could taste the meaning of freedom on her lips. Yet she knew this freedom was fragile, hanging by a thread. The chase had not ended. Back in Mississippi, Sheriff Donovan had uncovered something that shifted everything. He was beginning to see a pattern in Clara's movements, one that might reveal her final destination. He spread out 4 maps across the courthouse table, each one marked with red X's at the sites of Clara's killings. When he connected them, a clear line appeared, angling northeast. "She's not running at random," Donovan muttered. "She's going somewhere." The discovery came at 2:30 a.m. after hours of piecing together deaths, dates, and travel routes. In the dim light of the oil lamp, the shadows on the maps looked like dark confessions. The air was so heavy with tobacco smoke it seemed solid. Outside, September rain pounded the courthouse roof with relentless force, like fists demanding answers. In the corner, Dr. Webb bent over the maps, tracing the route with his finger. His trained eye spotted what others had missed. "Look at the names," he said quietly. "Henderson sold slaves to Bogard. Bogard's daughter married into the Lancaster family, and Margaret Whitmore, her maiden name was Henderson." He produced a yellowed ledger to prove it. The room fell silent except for the rhythm of rain. Clara's path hadn't been random at all. She was targeting a tight circle of families. But why them? What tied them together? The answer came from a water-stained bill of sale dated 1836, found among Judge Whitmore's personal papers. It recorded the sale of one Negro woman, age 19, named Clara, along with 2 young girls, ages 3 and 5. The seller, Henderson Plantation. The buyers, several different parties at the New Orleans slave market. "Dear God," Donovan breathed. "She's hunting the families who sold her daughters." 100 miles north, Clara, still traveling under the name Sarah Coleman, sat quietly in a small AME church outside Cincinnati. The congregation sang and swayed, voices rising together as the minister preached about Moses leading his people to freedom. The message filled the room with both sorrow and hope. Clara clutched the rosary she carried as part of her disguise. By now, it had become more than a prop. After the service, the minister's wife, Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, came to her side. "Sister Sarah, you seem burdened," she said kindly. Clara had perfected the art of weaving just enough truth into her lies. "I'm searching for my daughters," she answered, letting her voice tremble. "They were taken from me years ago. I was told they may have gone north." Mrs. Harper's face softened. She understood. Everyone in that community lived with the pain of families torn apart. "What were their names?" she asked. "Patience and Grace," Clara whispered. The names carried both prayer and poison on her tongue. "They'd be 18 and 20 now. I heard they were sold to a family heading toward Canada." Her voice broke naturally. What Clara did not share was the truth. She had spent years piecing together her daughter's trail, questioning anyone who might know, bribing for scraps of information, following paperwork as if she were hunting blood. She had learned that Grace was first purchased by the Lancaster family and Patience by the Beauregards. Both had been sold again within a year, but Clara had made sure their first buyers suffered. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, the search for her had taken on the tone of a holy mission. Plantation owners across 3 states demanded swift justice. The governor himself issued a proclamation, calling Clara a threat to the very foundation of their society. The bounty on her head leapt to $5,000, more money than most men would earn in a lifetime. At the Whitmore plantation, the new overseer, Patterson, ruled with calculated cruelty. Every enslaved person was questioned day after day. Meals were withheld if answers shifted. Children were separated from parents until someone broke. But the community stood firm. Their silence was unshakable, a wall built on shared loyalty and fear of what might happen if one of them betrayed her. A letter between plantation owners, dated September 3, 1847, carried a chilling warning. The Negroes know more than they admit. Extreme measures are advised. This conspiracy runs deeper than one deranged cook. An example must be made. It was not torture but sheer exhaustion that finally broke old Moses. At 71, after 5 days without proper food, old Moses broke down in his sleep. His lips moved, murmuring something about the teaching tree. Patterson caught it instantly. He shook Moses awake, demanding an explanation. She taught letters, Moses whispered, his 3-fingered hand trembling. Under the big oak, said knowing words was knowing power. The confession struck fear deep into Mississippi's white society. A literate slave was not just a threat, they were a weapon. Reading meant more than books. It meant the ability to measure doses, follow coded instructions, and even forge papers. Clara was no ordinary runaway. She had been trained for rebellion. Orders spread quickly. Every enslaved person would be tested for literacy. Anyone who could read faced brutal punishment or sale. Ruth listened as Moses confessed, hiding her thoughts carefully. What he gave them was true, but it was also useless. The teaching tree had been burned the night of the murders. All proof was gone. Clara had prepared them for this exact moment. Give them old truths, she had instructed, truths that sound useful but lead nowhere. Meanwhile, Donovan's theory was taking shape. If Clara was following the trail of her daughters, and if those daughters had indeed been sold north, then she would likely move along the same route many runaways took, through Tennessee, into Ohio, and maybe even further toward Canada. Telegraph every major city along that line, Donovan ordered. She's got a 3-week head start, but she'll have to rest somewhere. Someone will have noticed her. But Clara was always a step ahead. In Cincinnati, she shed the Sarah Coleman disguise. The elegant clothing vanished. She dressed instead like a laundress, blending easily into a community that had perfected the art of making people disappear. She took a job in a boarding house, paid only with food and shelter. Her skin, once lightened with lye, had darkened again. The extra padding she had worn to look heavier was gone. Now she was just another free black woman working to survive. But survival was no longer enough. Clara carried with her a tiny piece of paper, a torn scrap from a letter she had intercepted years ago. It described 2 young women, once enslaved, who were now running a school for black children in Ontario. The names were different, but the ages matched. One was said to have her mother's careful hands. The other's singing voice could move even angels to tears. Clara remembered those voices. She remembered the curve of Grace's left pinky, always bent slightly. She remembered the crescent-shaped birthmark behind Patience's right ear. These details lived inside her, etched into her memory deeper than any scar. At the boarding house, she watched and listened. Every traveler's story mattered. Every whispered word about someone heading north was another piece of the puzzle. Slowly, she began shaping her path toward Canada. But even as she built her cover, her invisibility had one weakness. Back in Mississippi, Dr. Webb continued analyzing her journal. In the pages, he noticed something no one else had. A peculiar way Clara wrote the letter G, she curled it at the base, unlike anyone else. He had seen that same curl before, on kitchen inventories, laundry lists, and even forged documents. She can change her face and her clothes, Webb told Donovan by telegraph. But she cannot change her handwriting. Search boarding houses, churches, anywhere she might work. Look for that curl in the G. The net was tightening, guided by two trails: Clara's handwriting and her relentless search for her daughters. By now, 7 bodies lay in Mississippi graves. And though Clara's mission was built on love, white Mississippi demanded blood in return. In Cincinnati, Clara wrote one last letter. She signed it with that same unmistakable G. It was a risk, but one she had to take. She addressed it to a school in Ontario, asking about 2 young teachers. She never knew the letter would never reach its destination. Authorities, already watching the mail, intercepted it. At exactly 4:17 a.m. the knock came, hard, sharp, against the boarding house door. Clara woke instantly. Her hand went first to the vial of poison, then to the bundle she always kept ready. Through the thin walls she heard the boots, several pairs, pounding up the stairs. To Clara, freedom had always sounded like footsteps in the dark. The boarding house sat on Elm Street in Cincinnati's Bucktown district, where free blacks and runaways had learned silence as survival. Rain lashed against the windows like shot. Clara moved quickly, every action rehearsed in her mind 100 times. She tucked the vial into her bodice, grabbed her bundle, and slipped toward the back stairs. At the front, Mrs. Washington, the owner, met the officers in her nightgown. Her confusion was careful, practiced. "Officers at this hour?" she asked softly. "What could possibly?" Deputy Marshal Franklin began, but he was cut off as he pushed past Mrs. Washington. "We're looking for a woman," he said, eyes scanning the dim rooms. "Goes by Sarah Coleman, among other names. Negro, about 30, small scar on her left hand." Behind him, 3 slave catchers waited, ropes coiled and faces hard with anticipation. The lead tracker, Briggs, had followed handwriting samples from Mississippi to Ohio, comparing every scrap of paper until he'd found Clara's letter at the post office. Now they believed they had her trapped. Clara reached the back door just as 2 men rounded the corner. The alley was blocked. Above, boots thundered through the house, doors splintering. Any other neighbors would buy her minutes at most, a community united in practiced silence. She ducked into the kitchen where a pot still held the last night's dishwater. The window was too small. The cellar was a trap, but Clara had survived 11 years of bondage by learning one rule: sometimes the only way out is through. "Check every room," Franklin's voice boomed above her. "She's here somewhere." Then Clara did the unexpected. She rose, carrying a wash basin, head wrapped in a cloth she'd grabbed from the laundry. When Deputy Franklin nearly collided with her in the hallway, she gasped and dropped the basin. Water splashed across his boots. "Oh Lord, sir, you frightened me." She shifted her voice, older and frailer now, pretending to be a washerwoman up early for linens. Franklin looked her over in the dim lamplight. The lye treatment was fatting from her skin. Exhaustion and quick thinking had given her the look of an older woman. She kept the scarred hand hidden beneath soapy water. "See any new boarders? A woman about your height?" he asked. "No, sir," she mumbled. I keeps to the washing, don't see much of nobody except dirty clothes." Franklin moved on, but Briggs stopped dead. Maybe it was her posture, the way she stayed utterly still, prey recognizing a predator. "Let me see your hands," he demanded. The moment stretched long as molten glass. Clara lifted her right hand, dripping soapy water. "This one, sir?" she asked. "Both," Briggs said, voice hard. Upstairs, a door slammed. Someone shouted, just enough noise to break the moment. Clara flung the remaining dishwater into Briggs's face and bolted for the front door. She hit Elm Street as dawn cracked the sky like an egg, pale light spilling over wet cobblestones. "That's her," Briggs howled, rubbing his stinging eyes. "That's the poisoner." Clara ran with the speed born of pure desperation. Cincinnati's streets were no Mississippi swamp, no hidden briar paths, no familiar darkness. Boots and voices multiplied behind her. Ahead, the city was waking. Delivery wagons clattered, dockworkers shouted, a world of witnesses opening like a trap. She dove down an alley, leaped a fence, and crashed through a yard where chickens exploded into panicked feathers. The Ohio River lay ahead between rows of buildings, wide, indifferent, the line between slave states and a chance at freedom. Crossing meant ferry tickets, papers she no longer had. The chase funneled toward the waterfront where morning fog rolled off the river like escaping spirits. Clara's breaths burned. The vial thudded against her ribs with every stride. "One swallow, this ends on my terms," she thought. But something stronger than fear drove her onward. The idea that her daughters might be only miles away, living lives she had torn free by killing for them. She reached the docks as the sun broke fully free. Steamboats lay moored like sleeping giants. Dockworkers paused to stare, some stepped aside, others moved too slowly, and Clara slammed into coils of rope and stacked crates. "Stop her," Franklin barked. $500 to the man who brings her down." That changed everything. Men who might have looked away now calculated quick gain. Clara found herself pushed toward the pier's edge where the Ohio lapped rotting wood. The water ran high from September rains, brown with upstream soil, fast enough to carry a body to the Mississippi. She spun to face them. 7 men formed a semicircle, cutting off every route. Briggs stepped forward, rope in hand. "It's over, Clara," he said. "Or should I call you Adonai?" Hearing her true name from his mouth felt like another theft. Clara's fingers closed around the vial. "You know nothing of who I am," she snapped. "You murdered 12 people," Franklin said. "Poisoned them at their own table, women, children." Clara laughed then, a sound as bitter as arsenic. "You want to speak of children?" Clara's voice cut sharp through the noise of the river. "Where were your laws when my bobbies were sold? Where was your justice when I begged for a chance to say goodbye?" "That doesn't give you the right," Franklin shot back. "Right?" Clara's tone rose, shaking the air. "You speak of rights. You who buy and sell people like cattle. You who rip mothers from daughters, wives from husbands. You who work us until we break and then sell the pieces." Behind the men, a crowd gathered. Free blacks, Irish dock workers, even well-dressed whites, drawn by the spectacle of this woman standing on the edge of everything, daring to speak truths most only whispered. "Whatever wrongs were done," Franklin barked, trying to seize control again, "the law demands." "Your law," Clara cut him off. She pulled out the vial, raising it high for all to see. "Your law says I'm property, says my daughters were property, says our lives matter less than your comfort. I reject your law." She uncorked the vial with deliberate care. Several men stepped forward but froze when she lifted it toward her lips. "I've spent 11 years serving poison hidden in food," she declared. "Today, I choose my own feast." "Wait!" A new voice broke through the crowd. Dr. Webb shoved his way forward, having just arrived on the morning train. He had studied her journals, her methods, her mind. "Your daughters," he said quickly. "Don't you want to know what became of them?" Clara faltered. The vial trembled in her hand. "I traced them," Webb rushed on. "After the Beauregards, after the Lancasters. Yes, they were sold, but not separated. A Quaker family bought them together and took them to Canada. They're teachers now, just as you suspected. Free women, educated, alive." "You're lying," Clara whispered, but her voice cracked with dangerous hope. "Grace has your hands," Webb pressed. "Patience sings in the church choir. They use the names you gave them, not the ones their masters forced upon them. They're free, Clara. They're free because you endured long enough to give them that chance." The crowd hushed. The river lapped. The sun climbed higher, burning away the fog. Clara stood at the threshold of land and water, capture and death, past and a future she would never see. "If I drink this," she said slowly, "I die a free woman. If I surrender, I die a slave. Either way, I die, but only one choice is mine." Her gaze swept across the water, toward Canada, toward daughters who might still remember her face, her voice, her hands teaching them to hide their brilliance until it was safe to shine. Then she looked back at the men who had hunted her, at the crowd who bore witness, at the city where she had almost disappeared. "Tell them," she said, "not just to Webb, but to the crowd, to history itself. Tell them their mother loved them enough to become a monster. Tell them their mother chose her own ending." Time seemed to shatter. The vial rose, men lunged. The crowd surged. And in that frenzy of movement and shouts, Clara made her final choice. Not the poison, not surrender. The river. She turned and leapt. The brown water swallowed her whole, like earth taking in a secret. They searched for hours, then days. The river yielded nothing. 3 bodies surfaced that September, 2 white men drowned in unrelated accidents and an elderly black woman from upriver. None were Clara. The Ohio kept her secret, its brown waters rolling stubbornly toward the Mississippi, protective and silent. Some say drowning is the worst way to die. But those who have never been enslaved don't know. Drowning happens in kitchens too. Sheriff Donovan stood on the Cincinnati docks at sunset, October 1st, watching the search crews drag nets through crimson-reflected water. Chains scraped against the river bottom, metal grating over whatever lay hidden. Local fishermen claimed the current could carry a body 20 miles in a single day, tangle it under fallen trees, or bury it in shifting silt banks like a living grave. "We need a body," Donovan told the crew for the 100th time. "No body, no proof, no proof, no justice." But then he paused, voice thick with something close to doubt. "What kind of justice?" he asked. "Chases a woman across 3 states for avenging her stolen children." The question hung in the evening air, thick as humidity. Dr. Webb stayed on in Cincinnati, officially to identify Clara's body if it surfaced. But his reasons had grown more complicated. He had spent weeks poring over her journals, her methods, her thoughts, her carefully recorded recipes of survival. What emerged wasn't the monster described in Southern newspapers. Instead, Webb saw a strategist of vengeance, a mother gutted by grief, a chemist who had turned kitchen knowledge into a weapon. From Dr. Webb's private notes, October 2, 1847. "The river police insist no woman could survive that current, but Clara survived 11 years of calculating dosages while feigning ignorance. Survival was her expertise." He returned to the boarding house where she'd lived. Residents suddenly remembered nothing. Mrs. Washington, the owner, swore she had never harbored a runaway, never heard the name Sarah Coleman, and certainly never seen a woman resembling Clara. Her denials were smooth, too smooth, the kind of practiced falsehood born of protecting lives. Still, Webb noticed details others overlooked. A loose floorboard in Clara's rented room. Beneath it, a hidden compartment containing $37, a train schedule for Canada, and a half-finished letter in her unmistakable handwriting. "My dearest daughters, if you remember your mother at all." She had been planning to reach them. The river had stolen that reunion, or had it? On October 7th, 40 miles downstream, a farmer named Thompson reported his skiff missing, along with fresh clothes taken from his wife's wash line. His wife also recalled seeing a figure near the river at dawn, too distant to identify, but moving with the careful limp of someone favoring the left side. Could have been anyone, the sheriff dismissed. But Webb remembered Clara's journal entry about dislocating her left shoulder as a child and how it still ached in cold weather. He said nothing, storing the detail away. Back in Mississippi, the Whitmore plantation went to auction. Its 47 enslaved people were scattered to new owners, their silence shattered by distance. Ruth was sent to a plantation near Jackson, where she continued teaching letters in secret using Clara's methods. Old Moses died that winter, finally laid to rest in ground softer than any field he had worked. The poisonings changed everything and nothing. Across the South, kitchens became sites of suspicion. Some plantations enforced strict new rules. Slaves could not handle food unsupervised, could not purchase supplies, could not possess anything resembling poison. But rules could not erase the fear Clara had planted, the knowledge that the powerless had power, that every meal carried risk. Patterson, the brutal overseer, lasted just 2 months at his next job before dying of what was reported as dysentery. The symptoms fit natural disease, but the enslaved community's calm reaction told another story. Clara had taught more than letters beneath that oak tree. Meanwhile, Cincinnati's autumn turned the riverbanks to gold and rust. The official search ended. Clara was declared drowned, but rumors whispered through Bucktown, passed in churches, markets, and alleyways. A woman seen at dawn collecting herbs by the river. A familiar face spotted on a northbound train. Envelopes of money left anonymously for families sheltering fugitives, always in the same amount, $37. In November, Webb traveled at his own expense to Ontario. He met Grace and Patience, now 19 and 21, teaching black children in a small farming town. They had taken the name Freeman, leaving behind the surnames of their enslavers. Yet the watchfulness in their posture betrayed a past that never fully faded. "We heard about the poisonings," Grace said quietly, folding hands so like her mother. "They say our mother did it." "What do you remember of her?" Webb asked. Patience answered softly, hands that could be gentle with cornbread and cruel when necessity demanded, a voice that sang us to sleep with songs from her mother's mother, eyes that went somewhere else when the master called her away. She taught us to read using flour on the kitchen table. She said knowledge was the only thing they couldn't sell. Grace added, "That's what stayed with us. That's what saved us." Webb showed them selected pages of Clara's journal. They read in silence, their faces unreadable. That night, however, neighbors reported hearing singing from their house, old songs in an older tongue, heavy with mourning and celebration at once. The truth formed like mist on the river. Clara had poisoned 12 people across 5 years, perhaps more. She had traced her daughters with meticulous care, forged documents, built networks of silence and survival. And then, at the very moment capture seemed certain, she had disappeared into the Ohio River. Vanished or transformed into legend. Bodies sink in muddy water, but sometimes they surface too. By December, reports of sightings had drifted in from as far as Detroit, Chicago, even Boston. People claimed a woman matching Clara's description working in a hotel kitchen. Abolitionists received a letter in that same distinctive handwriting. Money arrived for families of the enslaved, always in exact amounts. $37, $12, $1 for each Whitmore, and $5 for the year she'd planned. Sheriff Donovan filed his final report on December 22, 1847. Clara, Negro woman, cook, deceased by drowning while fleeing arrest for murder. Case closed. Justice served. But Dr. Webb didn't stop. Professional curiosity had turned into something deeper. He tracked patterns in the sightings, a steady northward progress, always close to water. He followed records of small poison purchases in towns along that route, tiny amounts, often listed as medicinal doses. Nothing looked suspicious to most people unless you knew what to look for. On Christmas Eve, Webb found an unmarked letter slipped under his hotel door. Inside was a single pressed magnolia blossom, the kind that didn't grow this far north, the kind someone would have to carry from Mississippi. No words, no signature, just that flower faintly scented speaking loud in its silence. That night Webb burned the flower and the paper, watching the evidence curl into smoke. Some truths, he decided, were better drowned than documented. After New Year's, he returned to his practice in Mississippi and kept quiet about Clara, but he kept her journal tucked in his medical bag. Late at night, he would read her notes about poison preparation and think about the thin line between medicine and murder, how the same hands that comforted could also destroy, how knowledge that healed could also harm. The river rolled on, carrying its secrets toward the sea. And somewhere in Ontario, in Chicago, in the places between history and legend, a woman who might or might not have been Clara kept moving, free, alive, unrepentant. The Ohio River never gave up her body. Rivers know how to keep the stories that matter most. 20 years later, in a Chicago boarding house kitchen, an elderly black woman trained new cooks and always spoke about seasoning the same way. "Remember," she'd say, stirring soup with steady hands, "the secret ingredient is always intention." Her name was Martha Washington, a common name, meant to be forgettable. She was old enough to be invisible. She wore gloves in the proper Victorian fashion to hide a scarred hand. The boarding house on State Street served mostly black travelers and European immigrants, people used to moving toward new lives. The kitchen smelled of onions and hope. Outside, the city was rebuilding after the Great Fire, rising from ashes like a story refusing to end. In the evenings, when the light went gold and the shadows grew long, Martha would stop stirring and stare at nothing, somewhere between memory and loss. Grace and Patience Freeman, Clara's daughters, visited once in the spring of 1868. They stood in the boarding house parlor like beautiful strangers, educated, careful, composed. They called her Mrs. Washington, their voices steady, not trembling. 2 hours was long enough to say everything and too short to fix anything. They spoke of their school, their students, the lives they'd made after escape. "We understand why," Grace told her, folding hands so like Clara's. But she added a truth many know: understanding is not the same as forgiveness. They never returned, though they sent formal, distant letters signed, "Your daughters in freedom." Martha kept those letters in the same hidden compartment where she kept $37 and the vial she no longer needed. A clipping from the Chicago Tribune, October 13, 1867, read, "Mysterious benefactor funds school for colored children. Anonymous donor provides exactly $1,847, a peculiar sum that echoes the year of unsolved Mississippi murders." The boarding house became known for more than good meals. Runaways found their way there. Even after the war erased legal slavery, Martha taught what she had learned: how to change your walk, your voice, your whole presence, how to forge papers with confidence, how to read danger in a white person's face before it reached your hands. She rarely mentioned Mississippi out loud, but Mississippi lived in her gestures, in the way she tasted every dish before serving it, in the locked cabinet where spices and other things were kept, and in nightmares that woke her screaming names no one else knew: Emma, Cornelius, Margaret, a dozen voices calling from sleep. Once a young helper named Sarah asked about the scars on Martha's hands, the big burn and the dozens of tiny cuts, as if she had gripped broken glass for years. "Every scar tells a story," Martha answered quietly. "Some stories are better left untold, but stories, like rivers, find their own paths." Dr. Webb died in 1871, his medical practice prosperous and his public reputation intact. After his death, his son found among his papers a journal and a letter marked to be opened only upon the son's own death. The letter held a confession. Webb admitted he had falsified his final report on Clara. The body of an elderly black woman found downstream had been officially listed as the poisoner, closing the case. But Webb had known the truth: the corpse had no scars, the age didn't match. The entire identification was a lie, carefully arranged. "Some justice," he wrote, "exists outside the law. Clara was guilty of murder, but the world that shaped her was guilty of worse. I chose to let the river keep its secrets." His son burned both the letter and the journal, but not before reading Clara's writings. They weren't just recipes for poison, they were instructions for survival: how to stretch hope for 11 years, how to love children you might never see again, how to turn anger into patience, patience into planning, planning into action. In Chicago, Martha Washington lived into her 70s. Her step slowed, but her mind was sharp as the knives she placed in the hands of young cooks. The boarding house thrived, becoming a gathering place for the black community, a kitchen where stories were shared and secrets kept. On a winter night in 1882, a young woman arrived looking for work. She introduced herself as Clara Freeman. Martha's breath caught, but her face revealed nothing. "My mother named me after someone she admired," the girl explained. "Someone who chose freedom over safety." This Clara was Patience's daughter, carrying her grandmother's name into a new generation. She had come to Chicago to study medicine, not in a school which wouldn't accept her, but through apprenticeships, borrowed books, and sheer determination. Martha taught her everything she could. Cooking, yes, but also chemistry disguised as recipes. How herbs could heal or harm depending on their measure. How to read hunger in a person's eyes and know if it was for food, for comfort, or for control. How to hide knowledge beneath humility. The granddaughter she had never expected to meet became her most loyal student. "Why teach me this?" the younger Clara asked one evening, after learning about substances that could either stop a heart or save it. "Because knowledge is power," Martha replied, echoing the words she had once spoken under an oak tree. "And in the right hands, power can change the world." The old woman died in 1885, peacefully in her sleep, or so her certificate claimed. But Clara Freeman discovered signs of a final dose, self-administered, timed perfectly. Even in death, Martha made a choice, not a surrender. At her funeral, an unexpected guest appeared, An elderly white woman from Mississippi, dressed expensively, her face hidden behind a black veil. She placed a single magnolia blossom on the coffin and left without a word. Later, it was discovered she was Emma Whitmore, the youngest grandchild at that poisoned supper, the one who had first complained about the bitter taste. Everyone had believed she died that night. But Clara had given the children a different dose, something to mimic death without causing it. The adults received her full vengeance. The children she spared, recognizing their innocence in a way no one had ever recognized hers. Emma had been smuggled out in a coffin, raised by abolitionists, and lived her life knowing she owed everything to the woman who both killed her family and saved her life. The boarding house survived until the turn of the century, run by Clara Freeman and others who had learned Martha's recipes. They served good food and stronger lessons, leaving behind a legacy seasoned with intention and memory. Yet even now some say that on hot, heavy nights in Chicago, when the wind carries the wrong kind of memory, kitchens fill with a strange smell. Nothing on the stove, yet the air is thick with magnolia and metal, arsenic and absolution. The scent of choices made in secret, served at tables where no one dares admit what they are truly tasting. During the demolition of the old boarding house in 1923, workers discovered Clara's journal hidden in the walls. The last entry, dated the night before she leapt into the Ohio River, held no recipes, no plans, no confessions. Just 4 words written in her unmistakable hand: "My daughters are free." Some chains only break when you are willing to become the monster the world already believes you to be. Clara knew it, lived it, and died by it. And her story continues, not in official records or history books, but in every kitchen where hands cook with care and intention. Because the poison was never just in the food. It lived in the system that made the food necessary. Even today, in certain southern towns, they still whisper about the Whitmore plantation murders. How 12 people died at a birthday dinner. How the cook vanished like smoke. How justice was never served, or maybe served too well, plated with silver and garnished with vengeance long overdue. And this is only the beginning. We've only scratched the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.